For years, people have been told the same story about modern dating. Casual relationships are a problem, hookup culture is destructive, and easy access to sex is ruining everything. That is the narrative. That is what gets repeated in opinion columns, in podcasts, in conversations between people who are convinced that something fundamental has broken down. But what if that narrative is only half the story? Because when you look closely at how modern dating actually works, something more complicated appears. Cheap sex, meaning sex that happens without long-term commitment attached to it, has changed the social marketplace in ways that are real and significant. It altered expectations. It shifted power dynamics. It reshaped how attraction functions at a practical level. But here is the part that rarely gets discussed openly. For some people, this shift created unexpected advantages, and understanding those advantages reveals something genuinely important about how modern relationships actually operate, beneath the surface of the criticism. When something becomes easier to obtain, its role inside a system changes. This is not a controversial observation. It is a basic principle that appears in economics, in psychology, in social behavior, across every domain where human beings make decisions about what to pursue and what to value. Scarcity creates pressure. Abundance creates freedom. And freedom changes behavior. When sexual relationships required long-term commitment as their entry price, dating followed a predictable and relatively rigid structure. People invested time slowly. They signaled long-term suitability. Trust developed gradually through sustained proximity. And the entire courtship process was oriented around demonstrating fitness for a permanent arrangement. That was the system. And that system made sense within the environment that produced it. But when casual relationships became more common, more accessible, and more socially acceptable, the structure changed. Suddenly, attraction, status, and attention started behaving more like a marketplace than a ritual. And in marketplaces, incentives always shape behavior. Always. From an evolutionary standpoint, attraction has never been a simple or static process. It has always involved ongoing negotiation between different competing priorities: reproduction, security, status, resources, emotional compatibility. Historically, long-term partnerships balanced these priorities through social norms and cultural expectations that were relatively consistent within any given community. The rules were clear. The expectations were shared. The pathway was defined. But modern societies introduced something that changed the calculation fundamentally. Choice, technology, social freedom, and shifting cultural norms dramatically increased the number of potential partners any individual could interact with at any given time. Dating apps alone expanded the visible pool of options to a scale that has no historical precedent. And when choice increases dramatically, the dynamics of attraction inevitably change in response. The environment becomes more competitive, more fluid, more influenced by short-term signals like confidence, social presence, and emotional energy, rather than long-term signals like stability, reliability, and financial security. Because when commitment is no longer required as the price of entry, the traits that matter in the short term start carrying more weight than they ever did before. For most of the 20th century, dating followed relatively structured expectations. Courtship had a recognizable shape. Commitment was the expected destination. And the timeline, while variable, moved in a broadly understood direction. Modern dating environments operate very differently. Relationships can begin quickly, develop quickly, end quickly, and restart just as easily. The flexibility is real, and that flexibility creates both genuine opportunities and genuine challenges, depending entirely on who you are and how you navigate it. Some people struggle with the uncertainty. they find the absence of clear structure disorienting. They perform well inside defined systems and find open environments difficult to read. Others thrive in exactly that kind of fluid landscape. Because when external rules become less rigid, individual behavior begins to matter far more than it did when the structure itself was doing most of the work. Confidence, social awareness, emotional intelligence, the ability to create genuine connection quickly. These traits begin shaping outcomes more powerfully than traditional markers ever could. And for people who have developed those traits, the modern environment is not a crisis. It is an advantage. Here is something that most people underestimate about modern dating. In this environment, attention functions as the most valuable resource in the entire system. Not money, not status, not physical appearance, though all of those things matter at various levels. Attention. Who receives it? Who controls it? Who generates emotional reactions consistently? These factors influence attraction more powerfully than almost any traditional marker of long-term suitability. And this matters because it changes what actually works. Individuals who understand how attention operates tend to navigate modern dating far more successfully than those who do not. Not because they are manipulating anyone, but because they understand the actual incentives shaping social interaction in this specific environment. And once you understand those incentives, behavior that previously seemed random or confusing becomes entirely legible. The person who does not respond immediately, the person who has a full life and does not rearrange it reflexively, the person who engages genuinely but does not overinvest before investment is reciprocated. These behaviors are not games. They are accurate responses to an environment where attention is the currency and scarcity of that attention determines its value. Which brings us directly to something that remains true, regardless of how the environment changes around it. Even in a world where casual relationships are common and access to connection is theoretically abundant, scarcity still plays an enormously powerful role. When something becomes extremely available, people begin instinctively valuing what remains rare. And in a dating landscape saturated with easy availability, what becomes rare is not access. It is genuine independence, authentic self-possession, the person who actually has a life they are invested in, who actually has standards they maintain, who actually does not dissolve their identity in the presence of someone they find attractive. That person becomes interesting precisely because they are not a reflection of what everyone wants to hear. They have shape, they have edges, and in an environment where most people are performing availability, someone who is genuinely selective becomes naturally compelling. Now, here is where many people take the wrong lesson from everything said so far. They hear that casual relationships are more available, that attention is the primary currency, that scarcity creates value, and they conclude that the solution is to pursue maximum novelty, to behave irresponsibly, to treat people as interchangeable and connection as disposable. And that interpretation misses the point entirely. That is not the insight. The insight is about understanding the environment accurately, not about responding to it cynically. Modern dating rewards certain traits more consistently than others. Emotional stability, self-direction, genuine confidence rather than performed confidence, the ability to be present without being desperate. These are not tactics. They are the natural expression of a person who has built an internal life worth inhabiting. And recognizing which traits the environment rewards helps people develop those traits authentically, rather than stumbling through a system they never examined. One of the most consistent patterns across attraction psychology, across cultures, and across different types of relationships involves emotional regulation. People who remain calm, grounded, and self-directed under social pressure consistently create stronger impressions than those who do not. And this is not about suppressing genuine emotion. It is about not outsourcing your emotional state to the reactions of others. The person who needs constant reassurance, who escalates when uncertain, who makes their internal stability dependent on how someone else is behaving toward them, that person communicates something specific at a subconscious level. They communicate that their emotional world is fragile. And fragility, however understandable in origin, does not generate attraction. Stability does. Confidence does. The quiet signal that says, "I am fine regardless of how this resolves." That signal is powerful because it communicates that being chosen by this person means something. They are not choosing out of desperation. They are choosing because they genuinely want to. When individuals have more freedom of choice, relationships shift from obligation toward genuine voluntary connection. And that shift, at its best, should theoretically produce stronger relationships. Because a relationship that exists because both people are actively choosing it, rather than because social pressure or structural necessity makes leaving difficult, carries a different kind of emotional quality. It is more honest. It is more present. It requires both people to continue showing up meaningfully rather than relying on inertia to hold things together. The challenge is that this version of relationships also requires more internal development from both people. It requires the capacity to choose consistently rather than just staying by default. And not everyone has developed that capacity, which is why the modern dating environment produces both its best and its worst outcomes simultaneously. For people with genuine self-awareness and emotional development, it can create remarkably honest and deeply chosen connections. For people without those qualities, it can produce exactly the chaos its critics describe. Understanding the difference between desire and commitment matters more in this environment than it ever did before. Desire creates attraction. It generates the initial pull, the emotional charge, the experience of finding someone genuinely compelling. Commitment creates stability. It generates the structure that allows something to develop over time, to deepen, to become something more than a series of intense moments. Both are necessary for a relationship that actually works long-term, but they do not always emerge at the same time, and they are not produced by the same behaviors. A person can generate enormous desire without ever creating the conditions for commitment. And a person can be deeply committed without ever generating the kind of desire that keeps a relationship emotionally alive. The modern dating environment tends to reward desire heavily in the short term, which is why so many connections begin with intensity and struggle to find sustainable structure. Understanding this dynamic does not solve it automatically, but it does prevent the confusion of mistaking one for the other, which is where most of the damage actually happens. So here is the honest conclusion. Modern dating environments are complex, they are frequently misunderstood, and they produce outcomes that look very different depending on who you are and what you bring to the situation. The criticism is not wrong. There are real costs to a system that prioritizes availability over investment. Real costs to a culture that treats connection as endlessly replaceable. But the criticism is incomplete, because the same environment that creates those costs also creates conditions where genuine confidence, authentic self-possession, and real emotional intelligence produce results that were far harder to achieve inside more rigid systems. Human attraction still follows predictable psychological patterns regardless of the cultural context surrounding it. Confidence, independence, emotional stability, the ability to be genuinely present without being needy. These traits continue shaping outcomes whether the environment is traditional or modern, structured or fluid. And the person who understands those patterns, who develops them not as strategy, but as genuine character, is the person best equipped to navigate whatever version of the dating landscape they find themselves in. Not by gaming the system, by understanding it clearly enough that they never have to.